Привit, I'm Chuck Olenek. I'm a Ukrainian-American baptized with the name Yaroslav, which is also the name that I use in the historical reenactment group, the Society for Creative Anachronism. Okay, I grew up in a Ukrainian household. I grew up speaking the language. And so it seems reasonable that I become fascinated with Slavic folklore and mythology. And in previous videos, I've told examples of the skazka. That's more like a Western European fairy tale or folk tale. So I put up a bunch of videos on my YouTube channel, which, by the way, would be really cool if you subscribe to that. And I also have recounted a number of the Belina. The Belina, these are tales about heroes. Okay, and in Ukrainian and Russian lore, there are three cycles. The first is of the elder bogatiri, like Svyatogor and Volk, which may have represented elder gods and kind of had to get cleaned up in a Christianized world. The second is about the younger bogatiri, like Ilya Muromets, Dobrina Nikitich, and Alyosha Popovich, who served at the court of Prince Volodymyr Brightson in Royal Kiev Town and engaged in heroic battles. But there's a third cycle of stories. I kind of got into the whole idea of the different cycles. It was sort of like wading through the Clark Ashton Smith short stories where they were set in different places, whether it was Hyperborea or Zothique or a number of his particular backgrounds. So here is the Slavic version of the third cycle. You can't really call these Bellini heroic because the heroes are very different from the godlike heroes in the first cycle, or the heroes that almost Arthurian heroes that served Prince Volodymyr in the Kiev cycle. And there's a different time period involved, and you can see it through the internal details of the stories. There's also a very different political background, and this is about the citizens of the wealthy trading city of Novgorod, or Novgorod, which is the pronunciation I prefer. This is a much smaller cycle than the other two, chiefly occupied with the adventures of only two really important heroes. They are Sadko, the rich merchant, and Vasily Busleev, a powerful man. Of these, the former must have been a very popular hero, since there's a whole bunch of Bellini about him where he is the leading figure. I'll tell his story later. Like Sadko, Vasily Busleev, he's part of that merchant class and city dweller class, and his adventures pretty much reflect like the clashing interests of a rich trading community. When you're looking at the Kiev cycle, there's heroic single combats, and it's kind of like, going through Homer or Beowulf, and they're undertaken by Ilya or Dobrina or Alyosha. But you get to the stories of Vasily, there's street fights between Vasily's druzhina, which was really basically a bunch of guys that he hired to be his thugs, and the citizenry of Novgorod. And it's a lot like, think Romeo and Juliet, Montagues and Capulets in the streets of Verona, only it's the streets of Novgorod. And the reciter of the Novgorod Bellini doesn't really look at Vasily very seriously, and even the church is a target for satire. The Bellini of Vasily Busleev are basically two stories which are normally independent of one another. Sometimes you'll find them combined into a single poem. The first tells of the early life of the hero in his native city of Novgorod, in which his father was very likely a posadnik or governor during his lifetime. This is the more popular Belina because This is pretty much the one filled with all the street fights and, Vasily basically showing might is right. So, it's the one that the bards tended to like to sing the most. The second one, that's his pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the purpose of cleansing himself of his own sins and arranging for prayers for the souls of himself and his relatives. And you have mom warning him not to commit any acts of piracy. And he ends up dying because of his own arrogance. Oh no, spoiler alert. Sorry, guys. Both stories are found widespread in the north of Russia, in Europe, but the story about his street thug days, like I said, that's the popular story. Those two tales about Vasily I covered in numbers 45 and 46 in the series, which you can go look up if you want to. But I had to explain his stories in order to have this next story make sense. Other Bellini, there are those of Terenti Danilovich, whom we're going to do now. He's also known as Terenti Host or Ghost, not like spooky ghost, but G-O-S-T, and that'd be Terence the Merchant. These tales, they're not apparently very popular. They apparently weren't sung very often by minstrels. And the story of Terente actually might have had a French origin. You might get the feel of one of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, but the setting and the details give you a glimpse into the wealth and the activity of the city of Novgorod at the time of her prosperity. The atmosphere and style of the cycle is wholly different from what's going on in the Kiev cycle of stories. Like there's references to the Hanseatic League. All right, that gives you an example. But you can also see borrowings from the Kiev cycle, such as different places like the Vadanov cross, or a reference to one's head lying on thorny shrubs, which doesn't quite fit with the vegetation up north. And there's actions like entering a room and you bow to all four sides of the room and you cross yourself and you bow lowest to the host and cross yourself there. So it's kind of a mix and match sort of thing. There isn't much to this particular tale of Terenti Host, but here it is. Who would tell us of the things of old, and of the things that have been? Of Terenti, Terenti the host, of Terenti Danilovich, the son of Danilo. Once there lived Terenti Danilovich in Novgorod town. He was a host, a merchant in the sovereign Lord Novgorod the Great, the jewel of the Russian lands, so inviting a place that merchants from the White Sea, from distant Holshnitsky, which the Germans call Holstein, from Okharovets, and even distant Tsargrad, did travel to display their wares in the markets and vie for the furs of sable and ermine, of fox, of marmot, and Terente enjoyed great profit from this trade. Alas, all was not well with Terente Host. He had a beautiful bride, Marfa, whose skin was like milk, her hair like a raven's wing, her eyes an icy blue which mirrored the coldness of her heart. For she was a creature of avarice, who was never satisfied with the profits made by Terente. Ceaselessly she complained, decrying the state of her wardrobe, that it made her look like a peasant compared to the Posadnik's wife, let alone the princess, the parties were never grand enough for her, and she made a great show of being heartsick over her lot. Then one day Marfa did not rise from her bed. She had become ill. "Husband mine," pleaded Marfa, "I am taken with illness and sadness. Pray you, good husband, go forth from Veliki Novgorod. Go to some foreign land and seek young Skomoroki, not old and blind ones, and bring them to me. Let the joy of the songs of these young men lift my heart and me from this bed." Terenti, the host, immediately saddled a horse and rode forth, seeking these wandering players to cure Marfa of her disease. Many roads he traveled, but any Skomoroki he encountered were old men, blind men, who played the guzli and sang of heroes. Terenti remembered his wife's words and passed these men by, asking where he might find young Skomoroki. At last he was told to ride north to Orechovets on Lake Ladoga, for there he would find such bards. This was a journey of 200 versts, but Terenti undertook it without hesitation, for he wished to see Marfa healed, and perhaps even happy. But Terenti did not get as far as Otonovets, and was standing on the Hazel Bridge by the Levadanov Cross, and some young playgoers passed him. They bade him go to the Holstinsky coast and buy Holstinsky furs. Terenti paid them gold to journey on to Veliki Novgorod and to seek out his wife, Marfa, while he rode on. Swiftly, Terenti went to the Holstinsky coast and bought the furs. And there he had an idea. He had himself inserted within the furs. The traders were paid good money to carry the furs to Novgorod the Great and to Terenti's home. There the Skomoroki gathered beneath the window at which Terenti's wife Marfa sat, and called out to her, saying that they bore word of Terenti. Marfa ran up to the window in her chemise without a waistband, and asked, "What word is there of my husband?" The young Skomoroki said, "Alas, you are a widow. Terenti is dead. His head is lying in the thorny shrubs on the road to Olsztynsky. His feet lie in the grass. Weeds are growing over his body." At this, Marfa cried out in anguish and cast herself upon the window-sill. Then she saw the furs. The young Skomoroki, of youthful beauty, each with curling golden locks, and with voices of angels, begged her to allow them to enter her high room to play the guzli and to say a requiem for the soul of the dead Terenti. At last Marfa relented, taken in by the beauty of the guzli players, and bid servants to bring them in, but bring in the furs as well. So they entered her lofty room, prayed to God, bowed low on all four sides, and especially to the widow of Terenti. But then Terenti leaped forth from the furs to the surprise of all, to the surprise of the young Skomoroki, and to his wife most of all. He chased the young men out, then turned to his wife, who had received the men in her chemise without a waistband. "It seems you are no longer ill, my good wife. You are no longer abed. I have a cure for you, Marfa." Terenti took a weight and began to trim his young wife into shape, and she learned to complain no more. It was at the feast I heard this tale. There it was, I drank mead ale. Though it flowed down my beard, my mouth stayed dry, for never a drop passed my lips, swear I.